Sleep now, and let the darkness of the siege enfold you. Let the distant rumble of bombardment become a lullaby, the flash of weapons fire a flickering candle in the window of a world at war. This is the story of Saturnine, the story of a trap within a trap, the story of sacrifice and slaughter, of ordinary soldiers who stood against gods, and of the terrible price that victory demands. The imperial palace had been built to last forever. Mountains had been shaved flat to provide its foundations. Continents had been reshaped to accommodate its sprawl. It was not merely a building, but a statement of intent, a declaration that humanity had risen from the mud of old night and would never fall again. Now that statement was being tested. The screaming of shells and the thunder of bombardment echoed through halls that had once known only the whispered conversations of diplomats and the measured tread of custodian guards. The golden spires were blackened with soot. The marble floors were stained with blood that would never wash clean. And in the deepest chambers, where even the sound of war barely penetrated, the masters of humanity gathered to make terrible choices. The siege had ground on for 100 days, 100 days of blood and fire, of walls crumbling and men dying by the millions. The traitor host had taken Lionsgate spaceport, breaching the outer defenses and establishing a beachhead from which they could land heavier forces directly onto Terran soil. The palace still stood, but it was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. In the depths of the Sanctum Imperialis, in a chamber lit only by guttering candles, Rogal Dorn gathered the most trusted souls in the Imperium: Constantine Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes; Malcador the Sigillite, Regent of the Imperium; and Genetia Kroll, Mistress of the Silent Sisterhood, whose presence deadened the psychic aether and ensured their words could not be overheard by any power, mortal or otherwise. They met in secret because what Dorn was about to propose could not be spoken aloud, could not be known by anyone outside that room. "There is a weakness," Dorn said. His voice was flat, toneless, the voice of a man about to confess a mortal sin, infinitely small but very credible, in the wall line near the Saturnine gate. It hadn't been detected or factored in before. Valdor frowned. "They've struck at nothing that far southwest. But they can, and they will," Dorn replied. "I would." The floor was almost invisible, a structural instability in the bedrock beneath the walls, undetectable by conventional surveys. Dorn had noticed it only by chance, a tremor in the stone that no one else had felt. He had spent days analyzing it since, running calculations that confirmed his worst fears. If Perturabo discovered that weakness, he could drive a spear-tip assault straight through the defenses and into the heart of the Sanctum Imperialis, a decapitation strike that would end the war in a single blow. "If you didn't notice it until now," Valdor asked carefully, "why would he?" "Because he's Perturabo," Dorn answered, "and one of us was going to slip sooner or later. The deciding mistake. I cannot risk assuming he has not." The question then became not whether to defend the floor, but how. They had 4 crisis points to hold Gorgon Bar, where Perturabo drove at the central line of Aegis generators; Colossi, where a breakthrough would give the enemy direct access to Lion's Gate; Eternity Wallport, the last spaceport still in Loyalist hands. And now Saturnine. They could not defend all 4 with equal strength. Something would have to be sacrificed. Dorn laid out the mathematics of war with clinical precision. The loss of Gorgon Bar would split the Sanctum open, 2 weeks to total defeat. The fall of Colossi would cut 5 months off their projected holdout time. A second spaceport in enemy hands would double their capacity to land ground forces. But Saturnine was a decapitation strike. If the enemy broke through there, they would be inside the Palatine core within hours. The war would end not in weeks or months, but in days. "We give up the port," Dorn said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "It is a massive loss, but it is the least worst of our options." Valdor's rage was terrible to behold, even controlled as it was behind the mask of custodian discipline. The Captain General of the Legio Custodes had sworn oaths to protect the Emperor that predated the Imperium itself. Every loss, every retreat, every sacrifice was a wound to his soul. But he understood the mathematics of war as well as any man living. He had fought beside the Emperor when Terra was still divided into warring techno-barbaric kingdoms. He knew what victory cost. "The port," he conceded. Malcador's ancient voice rustled like dead leaves. "The port." Kroll signed her agreement in the gesture language of the Silent Sisterhood. The shadow of her shivered in the candlelight, barely visible even to those who knew to look for her. Yet there was more to Dorn's plan than simple sacrifice. If they withdrew from the port openly, Perturabo would know they had discovered the Saturnine weakness. he would adjust his plans, send his elite force elsewhere, and the opportunity would be lost. Instead, Dorn proposed to defend the port, to make a convincing show of resistance, knowing all along that the defenders were doomed. He would send men to die, order them to their posts with a smile on his face, and never tell them the truth. "We would be condemning every soul who stands at the port to death," Malcador said quietly, "without doubt. We would send them out there knowing, and we couldn't tell them. They cannot know, or this ruse of yours falls down." Dorn's face was stone. "You're right. It's not how I ever thought I'd run a war. It's a burden we would have to bear, an unforgivable guilt. Every loyal warrior is oathed to give his life," Malcador said quietly, "for Terra, for the Emperor. That's why they commit and die. Rogal, that's all they need to know. It's all they know already." "It still sits heavy," Dorn admitted. "I am going to have to order men to their faces knowing." But there was no other way. If the deception held, if Perturabo committed his best forces to the Saturnine assault, Dorn would be waiting for them with kill teams of his finest warriors, not just to protect the palace, though that was paramount, but to strike a blow of true consequence. "Who would he send?" Malcador asked. "In your estimation?" "It's a spear-tip strike," Dorn replied. "Who would you send? Who was always the master of that kind of war?" The answer hung unspoken in the candlelit gloom. They all knew who Horus would send for a mission like this. Who would want that glory more than anything in the universe? The War Master himself. Kirill Sinderman had been an iterator once, a philosopher of the Great Crusade whose silver tongue had brought worlds into compliance with nothing but words. He had believed in the imperial truth with all his heart, the rational creed that there were no gods, no supernatural powers, only the light of human reason illuminating the darkness of superstition. Then he had seen the daemons. He had watched reality tear itself apart, had felt the touch of powers that should not exist. His faith in the truth had crumbled, replaced by a desperate, terrified belief in the Emperor's divinity, the very heresy the truth had been designed to prevent. He had nearly ended his own life. Standing on the Katabat terrace, the Emperor's favourite garden now gone wild and feral, he had looked down at the 1,000-metre drop and considered stepping off. What was there left to say? What was there left to record? History was dead. The future was nothing but horror. Then someone had reminded him that cowardice was not the only alternative to hope. If he wouldn't speak or write, he could still fight. He could take a jacket and a rifle and go to the walls. He could spend his end usefully. He had made it as far as the muster point before he realized that he was an atrocious shot. He would be wasting ammunition another could use better, eating rations that could fill other bellies, breathing air that could fill other lungs. But there was something else he could do, something only he was suited for. Now he walked the halls of the dying palace, gathering stories. Lord Dorn had reinstated the remembrancers, tasking them with recording the siege for posterity. It was an act of faith in its self-belief that there would be a future, that someone would survive to read what they wrote. His young assistant, Hari Har, followed at his heels with a data slate, recording everything Sinderman saw and heard. The boy was clever, diligent, and possessed of a quiet curiosity that reminded Sinderman of himself in younger days. He had a knack for asking the right questions, for drawing stories out of people who thought they had nothing worth telling. "Why bother with stories?" a soldier asked them once, as they sheltered in a freight yard while the world burned around them. "Why bother when we're all going to die?" "To create a history," Hari answered. "To commit to the future by believing there can be one, and to help that future understand itself." The soldier, Willem Cordy of the 33rd Pan-Pac Lift Mobile, considered this for a moment. He had survived the fall of Line 14, had walked through hell to reach the port. He had seen friends die in ways that would haunt him forever, assuming he lived long enough to be haunted. "I like that," he admitted. "I like the idea that the future is watching me in its memories." Stories were spreading through the siege like wildfire, tales of miracles and divine intervention, of the Emperor's grace manifesting in moments of desperate need. A convoy had been attacked on its way to the port, and a lone soldier had stood his ground against impossible odds until an angel descended from the sky to save him. The angel had been Sanguinius, of course, the great angel, primarch of the blood angels, whose wings and beauty made him seem a being from myth rather than genetic engineering. But to the soldiers who told and retold the tale, the distinction hardly mattered. They needed to believe in something greater than themselves, something worth dying for. The truth is in all of them, Joseph Bacco Monday explained to Hari. The Nordafric trooper had survived the fall of Line 14, had walked through hell to reach the port, and still he believed. People have to believe. It's wired into them. They need it. Euphrati Keeler had been a remembrancer too, once. A Pict artist who had documented the glories of the Great Crusade. Then she had seen a daemon aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and the Emperor's light had flowed through her to banish it. She had known, in that moment, that the Emperor was more than a man. He was a god, and she had been chosen to spread his word. The authorities had imprisoned her for heresy. The imperial truth was still official doctrine, even as daemons tore through the palace walls. But Sindaman had secured her release, knowing that the siege needed her faith more than it needed her silence. She walked among the faithful now, those who gathered in secret to worship the god Emperor. They called themselves light-bearers, and their numbers grew with every passing day. Every death, every horror, every impossible survival that seemed like a miracle, all of it fed the fire of belief. But faith was a double-edged sword, as they would soon discover. In the tunnels beneath Saturnine, 7 kill teams assembled. Each one comprised 100 of the finest warriors in the imperial fists, blood angels, white scars, and the disparate remnants of other legions who had found their way to Terra for this final stand. Each team had been given a call sign. The devotion, led by Sigismund the Templar, the greatest swordsman of his generation, who had made an oath to the Emperor that had consumed his entire being. Strife, under Nathaniel Garrow, former captain of the Death Guard turned knight-errant, who had been the first to bring warning of Horus's treachery to Terra. Black Dog, commanded by Endrid Har, the Riven Hound, a Black Shield who had forsaken his legion to fight for humanity alone. Brightest, with Belsepatus of the Blood Angels, Captain Paladin of the Keruvim host. 7th, Helios, and finally Naismith. Naismith, the call sign had been Garviel Loken's choice, a word Sindaman had taught him, long ago in a different age. A naysayer, one who disagrees and challenges, who questions the consensus and demands proof. I intend to disagree and challenge, Loken had explained when asked. The balance has gone. We need Naismiths more than ever. Loken wore the sea green of the Lunar Wolves, not the corrupted sons of Horus, but the Legion as it had been before the fall, the colours of his youth, when his Primarch had been a hero instead of a monster. He had painted over the eye of Horus on his pauldron, replacing it with the old wolf's head that the X-16 had worn before Ulanor. He expected the colours to provoke a psychological effect on his enemies, to remind them of what they had been, what they had lost, what they had betrayed. He was not wrong. The kill teams waited in deployment halls and reinforced chambers, their weapons ready, their oaths sworn. Each warrior had made a vow before the Praetorian, a promise of what they would accomplish, or how they would die trying. The oaths had been written on scraps of parchment and pinned to their armour, declarations of intent that would be their epitaphs if they fell. Sigismund's oath had been the most elaborate, a complex declaration of devotion and sacrifice that invoked the Emperor's name a dozen times and promised rivers of traitor blood. Garrow's had been solemn, a reaffirmation of the vows he had taken when he became a knight-errant. Loken's had been the shortest, Lupercal, he had said. Just the one word. Everyone knew what he meant. He had sworn to kill the War Master or die trying. "Are you set?" Sigismund asked him, as they waited for the enemy to arrive. "Yes, you." "Yes." The Templar paused. "I liked your oath." "The shortest one of them all." "Yes," said Sigismund. "But a good one. I wish it had been mine." Sindaman had found Loken in the deployment hall before the battle began. The old Iterator had slipped his handlers to seek out the warrior he had known since the early days of the Great Crusade. "It seems an age ago when I last saw you in those colours," Sindaman said. "A different age, Kirill," said Loken. "Quite so. You think of them as your true colours, always. But I am expecting them to provoke some psychological effect." "If he is coming," Sindaman asked, "what will you do, Garviel?" "He was your beloved master once, and—" "Kill him," said Loken flatly. "I'll kill him." Sindaman nodded slowly. "History tells us that a culture may be in morbid decline when sons turn on their fathers. My father turned on me," said Loken. "I don't need history to tell me anything." Above ground, Mistress Tacticae Katerin Elg took her place in the forward command post. Her hands moved across keypads, bringing displays to life, opening communication channels to the wall guard vigil that watched the surface approaches. "Trickster, this is Trickster," she said, her voice steady and declarative. "Show Trickster live at this time. All kill teams report status, datacast only." The operation was called Trickster because that was what it was, a deception within a deception. The enemy would come thinking they had discovered a weakness. They would find only death, if the enemy came at all. If Dawn's gamble paid off. Eternity Wall Port was dying. High Primary General Saul Niboran commanded the defense from Monsalvent Guard, the great bastion that guarded the port's western approaches. He was old by any standard that mattered, a veteran of the Saturnine Ordos, schooled in the rigid discipline of textbook warfare. He had come to Terra expecting to apply those lessons in defense of humanity's birthworld. Instead, he had been given an impossible task with insufficient forces and ordered to hold anyway. He did not know why reinforcements never came, did not know that Dawn had deliberately weakened the port to draw attention away from Saturnine. He only knew that his men were dying by the thousands, and that no matter how many enemy they killed, more kept coming. The port was a megastructure of staggering scale, a vertical city of landing pylons and cargo bays, processing centers and habitation blocks. Its towers soared kilometers into the sky, piercing the void shields that still protected its upper reaches. From its platforms, ships had once risen to carry humanity to the stars. Now those platforms were killing grounds. Shiban Khan of the White Scars had seen it from the beginning. The Taxir had argued for demolishing the bridges and access routes, for turning the port into a killing ground that would bleed the enemy dry. But Niboran had followed doctrine instead, keeping supply lines open in hope of reinforcement. That hope had been a mistake. Meanwhile, at Colossi Gate, another battle raged. The Khan Jahatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, the Warhawk of Chagoris, had been sent there by Dawn as a compromise. The Great Khan had wanted to take the offensive, to strike at the enemy spaceport and cripple their orbital capacity. Dawn had refused. So he had given Jahatai Colossi instead, where mobile warfare was still possible, and sent Valdor to keep an eye on his wayward brother. Against them came Magnus the Red and Mortarion, the Pale King. The two Daemon Primarchs made strange allies. Mortarion had spent his life hating Psykers, had built his entire legion around the ideal of endurance through suffering rather than reliance on the warp. Now he was as much a creature of chaos as any of his brothers, his soul bound to the plague god Nurgle, his body racked with pestilences that would have killed any mortal 1,000 times over. He hated what he had become, but hatred changed nothing. Magnus had shown him compassion, or something that looked like it. "I forgive you," the Crimson King had said, and for a moment the relief of that absolution had eased Mortarion's torment. It was manipulation, of course. Everything Magnus did was manipulation. He needed Mortarion's Death Guard as blunt instruments to crack the walls, to open the way for his own designs. But in the moment, even false kindness had been welcome. The assault on Colossi had been devastating. Never-born daemons, to use the human word, had manifested in their thousands, their flesh forms birthed from the bleeding wound in reality that the siege had opened. The 1,000 Suns had wielded psychic powers that made the defenders' minds bleed. The Death Guard had marched through poison clouds of their own making, immune to the plagues that killed everyone else. And yet Colossi held. The White Scars Stormseers had used the fractured void shields as amplifiers, focusing their elemental powers into lightning storms that burned the Neverborn from the sky. Valdor had led the Custodians in a countercharge, his golden warriors methodically destroying the daemon flesh with blows empowered by the Emperor's own will. The Khan himself had ridden out at the head of his jetbike squadrons, cutting through the fleeing 1,000 Suns like wind through wheat. Magnus had retreated, claiming he had achieved his true objective, whatever that meant, and left Mortarion to regroup alone. It was a victory, but there would be no time to celebrate. The World Eaters came like a tide of blood and madness. They brought no strategy, no tactical finesse, only an endless, screaming rage that could not be reasoned with or deterred. Their Primarch, Angron, had become a daemon, a thing of nightmare given flesh. His sons followed him into the abyss, the butcher's nails in their brains driving them to ever greater heights of fury. At the Pons Solar, Camber Diaz made his stand. Lord Castellan of the Fourth Sphere, he had been one of the finest officers in the Imperial Fists. He had led a ragged band of survivors through the ruins of Magnifican after the fall of Line 14. had gathered lost soldiers and given them purpose, had fought his way to the port through horrors beyond counting. Now he stood at the eastern end of the great bridge, his siege shield before him, his longsword in his hand. He had drawn a line in the rockcrete with his blade, a mark that said this far and no further. "We stop them here," he roared to his men. The World Eaters came screaming across the bridge, and Diaz met them. He fought like a storm, his blade a blur of killing light. The soldiers around him, ordinary humans, mortal men with las rifles and courage, held as long as they could. They died in their dozens, their hundreds, their thousands, but they held. Until they couldn't hold any longer. The bridge fell. Diaz fell with it, surrounded by the slain, having never taken a step back. Genetia Kroll, mistress of the Silent Sisterhood, saw his body during the retreat. She reported what she had witnessed to Niboran in the gesture language of her order, her pale face expressionless. The Huskal Cadwalder asked if Diaz was lost or dead. "Dead," Kroll confirmed. Dead along with almost all who stood with him. The stories spread. A soldier named Oli Piers Olympos Piers, to give his full name, though no one had called him that in 50 years, carried a battle banner through the carnage. He had raised it in a freight yard, hoping others would rally to it, hoping the Emperor would see their faith and send his grace. The angel came, not to save them, but to slaughter the World Eaters who pursued them. For a moment it seemed like a miracle, like proof that faith could move the universe. Then the World Eaters regrouped and came again, and this time no angel descended. Piers stood before the banner anyway. He stood as Angron himself approached, a daemon primarch the size of a building, wings spread like a bat from hell. "Come on then," Piers cried, his voice cracking. "And see what happens." He fired his caliver until the power pack ran dry. He screamed the war cry of the Upland Tertio, the regiment he had served with for 50 years. He stood until the end, because standing was all he had left. The banner fell, soaked in blood, slipping from its broken pole, fluttering to the ground. Kroll fell too. The Silent Sister had killed daemon after daemon, her nullifying presence burning their borrowed flesh. She had slain Goret Falmor and Centurion Sisaka Warhand, Mahog Dearth and Haskell Bloodsmoke, Nurtot of 2 Triari and Karakul White Butcher. Then Khan came. The first captain of the World Eaters was beyond sanity, beyond reason, beyond anything remotely human. The Butcher's nails drove him into a fury so deep that even Kroll's null curse could not slow him. He killed her so quickly that he didn't even notice, just a flicker in his tally count, a moment of confusion that passed as the rage deepened. She had been one of the most powerful beings in the Imperium. Against Khan, she was just another number. Deep beneath Saturnine, the sensors detected movement. Seismic monitors picked up the vibration of termite boring machines grinding through stone. Listening posts heard the distant rumble of approaching engines. The enemy was coming through the bedrock, exactly as Dorn had predicted, exploiting the flaw that no one was supposed to know existed. "Contact," Elg reported. Her voice remained calm, professional. Multiple subsurface tracks, bearing consistent with predicted approach vectors. In the deployment halls, kill teams made final preparations. Weapons were checked, oaths were whispered, last words were exchanged between brothers who might never see each other again. Loken gripped Rubio's sword, a dead blade now, its psychic power extinguished with its former owner. But it had served him well, and he would carry it into battle one last time. "Are you set?" Sigismund asked him. "Yes, yes." The Templar paused. "I liked your oath. The shortest one of them all. Yes, but a good one. I wish it had been mine." The termites breached into the prepared kill zones, zones mortalis, the chambers called, killing grounds designed to channel and contain the attackers, to deny them maneuver space and force them into the teeth of prepared defenses. Sons of Horus poured from the boring machines, their sea-green armor stained with the marks of chaos. Behind them came the Justrin Terminator elite, the deadliest warriors in the XDA Legion, and at their head, Abaddon. The first captain of the Sons of Horus was everything the legends said and more. Massive even by Space Marine standards, clad in Baroque Terminator plate, wielding weapons that had killed heroes beyond counting. He had been at Horus's side from the beginning, had been part of the Mournival that had advised the War Master before his fall. Now he came to claim the greatest victory of all. The kill teams met them in the tunnels. The fighting was brutal beyond description. Space Marines slaughtered Space Marines in chambers designed to amplify every horror of close combat. Bolters roared, chainswords screamed, and the walls ran red with transhuman blood. Loken fought his way through the carnage, searching for one face among the enemy. He found it at last, not Horus, not the Primarch he had sworn to kill, but something almost worse. Tormageddon. The name meant nothing to most, but Loken knew what lay beneath that twisted armor. He knew whose corpse the daemon had claimed for its vessel. Tarik Torgadon, his friend, his brother, the finest swordsman in the Lunar Wolves, the heart of the old Mournival, dead these 7 years but denied even the peace of the grave. The daemon wearing Tarik's body smiled at Loken with teeth that had once laughed at his jokes. Garvey, it said, using Tarik's voice. One word, just his name. Loken attacked. The duel lasted an eternity. Tormageddon was fast, impossibly fast, driven by infernal power that cared nothing for mortal limits. Loken was better, more skilled, more precise, but skill meant little against raw daemonic might. He read the fight as it developed, saw that the creature's angles of attack were awkward, as though something vast was trying to force itself through a vessel too small to contain it. The daemon had strength, but it lacked the decades of honed instinct that had made Tarik deadly. Loken forced it into errors, lured it into overreach, drew its balance too far forward. Their chainswords locked, screaming as teeth sheared against teeth. He thrust Rubio's blade at Tormageddon's heart, and it slid aside. Even with all his force behind the blow, he couldn't penetrate the daemonic armor. Every shred of skill had won him that moment. Every ounce of strength hadn't been enough to make it count. Tormageddon seized his head in a chain fist and began to squeeze. Ceramite crumpled. Loken's visor shattered against his face. He felt bones crack, felt consciousness slipping away. We'll not die this way. He stabbed, blind, desperate, willing the blow to land. Rubio's blade, dead and cold for 7 years, suddenly blazed with pale light. The force sword found Tormageddon's heart and drove home. The daemon collapsed. The infernal power fled, leaving nothing but a broken corpse. Tarik's bones, finally released from torment. Loken tore off his ruined helmet and looked at his hand. Traceries of lightning played across his fingers, fading even as he watched. He did not understand what had happened, did not know why the blade had chosen that moment to wake. But Tarik was free at last, and that was enough. On the surface, the Emperor's children struck at the Saturnine wall. They came not through the tunnels but over the battlements, scaling the walls while their brothers died below ground. Fulgrim's legion had not been part of Perturbo's careful plan. They had simply seen an opportunity for glory and seized it, heedless of coordination or strategy. It was, in a way, their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. The Emperor's children did nothing by halves. Their assault was devastating in its fury, their warriors empowered by the dark gifts of Slaanesh to heights of speed and skill that defied mortal limits. Lord Commander Eidolon led them personally, Eidolon, whose daemonic gifts had granted him the strength of a Primarch, whose sonic screams could shatter ceramite and bone. He had died once before, beheaded by Fulgrim himself in a fit of PK, and had been resurrected by the dark powers he served. Death held no fear for him now. Only sensation mattered, the exquisite joy of combat, the pleasure of killing, the rapture of victory. The defenders had not expected this. The trap had been laid for the underground assault, not for a simultaneous attack from above. The wall guard was thin, stretched to cover too many sectors with too few warriors. Dorn met them himself. The Praetorian of Terra had been monitoring the underground battle from the forward command post when word came of the surface assault. He had not hesitated. Within minutes he was on the wall top, his greatsword singing through the air, his golden armor blazing in the reflected light of burning gun towers. He fought like the demigod he was. Each stroke of his blade reaped lives. Each blow of his fist shattered armor and bone. The Emperor's children threw their finest champions against him, warriors who had killed heroes beyond counting, whose names were whispered in fear across 100 worlds, and he cut them down like chaff. Von Calder died screaming with an adult's death cry from his child's face. Ilarus crawled on all fours for several seconds, searching for his severed head. Simomus's body split apart as Dorn caught him. Zeneb Zenar fell to his knees and tried to hold his sheared torso together with both arms. Lecus Phodion, the Vexillarius, was sent cartwheeling away in a welter of blood. 16 of Fulgrim's finest fell to Dorn's blade before they surrounded him, raking and jabbing, driving him back toward the edge of the wall. Then Sigismund arrived. The Templar's blade took Quine Milosar's head in a shower of peacock feathers. The champion's reach had been extreme, his chrome sabres a blur of death, but Sigismund was faster. He killed Yanvar Kell with 2 hacking blows, then turned to face Eidolon himself. Praetorian and Templar fought back to back, covering each other's guard, turning together to drive away the circle of killers. They deflected cuts and thrusts, snapped golden spears, and endured the keening, concussing screams. "To the glory of him on earth," Dorn roared. "To the death," Sigismund shouted. Eidolon surged in again, his daemonic speed making him almost impossible to track. Sigismund charged to meet him, knocking warriors aside. The two fought like furies along the edge of the wall, both possessed, but only one a daemon. When Eidolon, gleeful, rammed his sword through Sigismund's collarbone, the Templar snarled, seized the bare blade impaling him, and used his body weight to tear it from his enemy's grip. Eidolon looked appalled as Sigismund came on, the sword still wedged through his shoulder. He scrambled backwards. The Templar's chained blade ripped Eidolon's pink plate open. Blood like quicksilver, like liquid chrome, sprayed out and dappled Sigismund's armor. Sigismund kicked him over the ledge. The Lord Commander's flailing body plunged 1,100 meters into the burning darkness below. He would not die from the fall. Daemons were hard to kill, but he would take no further part in this battle. On the wall top, Imperial fists and auxiliar troops drove the remaining Emperor's children into the night or into death. Below, the ravaged host of the 3 Legion, perhaps in answer to some petulant summons from their fleeing lord, began to withdraw. They left 18,000 of their dead behind. The voids flared back to life overhead as the breach was sealed with lockcrete, and weary men raised a ragged cheer. A few last confirmation shots echoed around the battlement. Dorn crouched beside the broken form of Captain Madius, who had held the wall with raw recruits against champions of chaos. "Did we win, my lord?" Madius asked through a film of his own blood. "This is what victory feels like, Wallmaster," said Dorn. "I'll make damn sure you live long enough to get used to it." "What did we win, Praetorian?" "The day," Dorn replied. "We won the day." Below ground, the outcome was less clear. Abaddon had carved a path of carnage through 3 kill teams before they brought him down. The first captain of the Sons of Horus had found what he was looking for in those killing chambers, pure combat, stripped of politics and treachery and the corruption that had consumed everything he loved. This moment was his life in its purest form, his life distilled. He fought Imperial fists and black shields and blood angels, for no other principle than to find out who was best. There were no sides, no good or bad, no rebel cause or loyalist alliance, no warmaster, no emperor, no point to anything outside the broken, blood-smeared walls of the killing chamber. Just war, only war. The binary test of the galaxy, that you passed in triumph or failed in glory. Death, rushing closer, was immaterial. He had killed Belsapatus, captain of the Cheruvim, with a single stroke, a duel that had lasted seconds but felt like hours, their blades moving faster than mortal eyes could follow. Sepatus had been amazing, his swordplay nuanced beyond anything Abaddon had faced before. He had been sorry to kill him. He had broken Garrow's chest and left him dying against a wall. The former Death Guard had fought like a devil, his sword Libertas carving wounds that would have killed lesser men. But Garrow was only human in the end, transhuman, yes, but still limited by the flesh in ways Abaddon was not. He had fought Endrid Har to a standstill, the Rivenhound's power fist hammering at his skull until his helmet cracked and his face became a mask of gore. Har had taken 6 or 7 kill thrusts in the belly and chest and refused to die. Just refused. His strength seemed to grow as the blood wept out of him. In the end, Abaddon's blade had found Har's throat and slid in, up into the brain, and out through the back of the Black Shield's head. But Har's dead weight had pinned him to the wall. Garrow had risen again, that sword of his, gleaming. He raised it for the killing blow. "No," Garrow yelled, punching the wall in frustration. The teleport flare had already faded. Abaddon was gone, snatched away by the termites' emergency teleport grid, its operators having repositioned during the battle to extract their commander. In the end, it took a teleport extraction to save him. His termite had repositioned during the battle, and in the 13th minute of his last stand, Abaddon vanished in a flash of displaced air. "Let me go back," Abaddon whispered in the termite's hold, weeping as his wounds were treated. Let me go back. He had found what he was looking for in that killing chamber. Pure combat, stripped of politics and treachery and the corruption that had consumed everything he loved. Just war. Only war. The binary test of the galaxy. He had never wanted it to end. One traitor escaped the tunnels entirely. Horus, Axaman, Little Horus, they had called him, for his resemblance to the War Master, fought his way through the support areas until he reached the surface. Wounded but alive, he found himself deep within the Imperial Palace, with no way back to his brothers. Loken found him in a gloomy gallery, half lit by the glow of dead plants in hydroponic tanks. Garvey, Axaman said, recognition flickering in his eyes. Thonian for sorrow. Little Horus. I don't know who's little anymore, Axaman replied. He raised his sword, mourn it all, a blade as cursed as its name. You've come to kill me. Yes. Their duel was brief. Both were exhausted, wounded, operating on reserves that had long since run dry, but Loken was the better swordsman, and Axaman's injuries had robbed him of his edge. At the end, with Axaman disarmed and broken, Loken asked him a question. Did you know? At Istvan, did you know what Horus planned? No, Axaman answered. I found out when everyone else did, when the guns opened fire. It was not absolution. Nothing could absolve the crimes of the sons of Horus. But it was, perhaps, an explanation. Loken killed him cleanly, a mercy stroke to the heart. Then he stood over the body of the last member of the old Mournival, the Brotherhood that had advised his Primarch before the fall, before everything turned to ash. He was the last one now, the only Lunar Wolf left who remembered what they had been. He picked up Axaman's sword. Mourn it all would serve him well in the battles to come. The 26th of Quintus, a day that would be remembered or forgotten, depending on who survived to tell the tale. Saturnine had held. The floor had been sealed with lockrete, pumped into the tunnels by teams working around the clock under the direction of Arkan Land, the techno-archaeologist who had been pressed into service as an emergency engineer. The kill teams had reaped a terrible harvest, hundreds of sons of Horus dead, including much of First Company. The Justerin would never fully recover. But the War Master had not come. Horus had sent his best and stayed behind, perhaps sensing the trap, perhaps simply unwilling to risk himself when victory seemed assured. Dorn had hoped for more, had hoped to end the war in a single stroke, but the gambit had still succeeded beyond reasonable expectation. Eternity Wall Port had fallen to Angron and the World Eaters. The Daemon Primarch had led his legion in a slaughter that would haunt the memories of every survivor. 29,000 civilians had died alongside the soldiers who tried to protect them. High Primary Naboran was dead. Janitia Kroll was dead, killed by Kern, so quickly the captain of the 8th Assault Company hadn't even noticed the stroke that ended her. Camber Diaz was dead, and thousands of others whose names would never be recorded. The port's fall gave the traitors a second orbital access point, doubling their capacity to land-ground forces. The siege had just become much harder. Dorn spoke of this to Sanguinius in a private chamber, away from the strategiums and command posts where other ears might hear. I had hoped for more, he admitted. Sanguinius tilted his head, quizzical. He laughed in astonishment. You tell me all of that, all of what you accomplished, and yet you preface it with, I had hoped for more. What more could there be? So much, said Dorn, his expression grim. For a moment, there seemed a chance to take Lupercal himself. But no, I was denied. The great angel rose to his feet, arms wide, wings rippling. Fulgrim's departure is a great prize, still, he cried. Great terror, Rogal, this is a victory for us. For you. Dorn nodded slowly. And I mark it as such. He looked at his brother ruefully. You know the real irony? Fulgrim could have taken the wall. The power he has, the legion strength, the unimaginable daemon gifts. He cut the wall wide open, brother, wide open. But for a stroke of fortune, I held it closed. Fulgrim got deeper and faster than any of them so far. Excess was his undoing, as ever. The brazen confidence of overstrength. He threw his whole damn legion into a space too small. Dorn shook his head. I tell you this plainly, brother. If the War Master or the Lord of Iron had ever managed to harness him, he would have won this for them in a matter of days. He could have been their greatest weapon. Some of us are hard to control, said Sanguinius quietly. Some of us always have been. Yet there was hope. Sanguinius brought the news to Dorn personally, his wings folded behind him, his beautiful face alight with something that had been absent for too long. Nuceria is destroyed, he said, eradicated by fleet action. There is only one thing that could have done that. Dorn stared at him. They're coming. They are coming at last. Robout, the Lion. The others are finally coming. Guilliman and the Lion, with their legions intact. The Ultramarines and the Dark Angels, who had been delayed, redirected, fighting their own battles across the galaxy while Terra burned. They were coming at last. The siege was far from over. Months of fighting remained, perhaps years. Millions more would die before the end. But somewhere beyond the burning sky, beyond the veil of poison clouds and orbital debris, reinforcements were finally on their way. It was not victory, but it was something better than despair. It was hope. In the Blackstone prison, Custodian Amon visited a cell. The prisoner within was named Foe, and he possessed knowledge that Amon found deeply troubling. Knowledge of how to kill a perpetual, how to permanently end a life that should be immortal. Foe had been a student of the dark sciences in ages past, had learned secrets that no sane man should know. Write it down, Amon commanded, tossing him a data slate. It's not as simple as that. I need a laboratory, dedicated biotechnical apparatus, access to all data archives, time to plan it precisely. Just the basics, the principles, the fundamental elements, the details can come later. Write it down, all of it. No one knew why Amon wanted such knowledge. Perhaps he didn't know himself, but somewhere in the universe there were beings who could not die, and Amon believed there might come a time when that needed to change. In a small cubicle lit by candles, Loken laid out his blades, 3 swords now. The chainsword he had taken from a fallen imperial fist, Rubio's gladius, still cold and dead after its moment of blazing life, and mourn it all, Aximan's blade, with its frosty gleam. Will you use that? Cinderman asked from the doorway. A good weapon is a good weapon, Loken replied. But 3 swords? Garviel, I hesitate to point out the number of hands you have. Loken almost smiled, almost. The siege would continue. More battles, more deaths, more desperate stands against impossible odds. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to rest. Tomorrow would bring new horrors. Tonight, there was only the darkness, and the silence, and the distant rumble of guns. Across the palace, other survivors found what comfort they could. In a hospital ward, Sigismund lay while apothecaries worked to remove the sword that had been driven through his collarbone. He did not cry out. He did not even close his eyes. He simply stared at the ceiling, his lips moving silently in prayer. Somewhere in the depths, Abaddon's termite ground its way back toward traitor lines, carrying its wounded cargo. The first captain would survive. He would fight again, and when he did, he would remember what he had learned in those killing chambers, that war was the only truth, and victory the only absolution. High Primary General Saul Niboran's body would never be recovered. It lay somewhere in the ruins of Monsalvent Guard, buried under rubble and the corpses of his men. He had died doing his duty, never knowing that his sacrifice had been planned from the beginning, that he had been sent to die so that others might live. The banner that Ollie Piers had defended lay in the mud of a freight yard, soaked in his blood. No one would retrieve it. No one would remember who had raised it, or why. It was just another piece of cloth in a war that had consumed worlds. But somewhere, on a data slate that had been passed from hand to hand among the survivors, the stories were being written. Joseph Munday had shared the Lectitio Divinitatis with everyone he could find. He had added his own story and the stories of others. The faith was spreading, even as the port burned. Perhaps that was the real victory, not the wall that had held, or the tunnel that had been sealed, but the stories that would survive when everything else was gone. Sleep now, if you can. Let the sounds of war fade into memory, the screams of the dying become whispers on the wind. Dream of soldiers who stood against gods, of ordinary men who refused to run, even when running was the only sane choice, of banners raised in defiance, knowing they would fall. Dream of Ollie Piers, standing alone before the Red Angel, his caliver spitting fire until the last moment. Dream of Camber Diaz, who drew a line in the stone and swore that none would pass it. Dream of Genetia Kroll, whose silence was more powerful than any scream, whose absence now echoes through the palace like a wound that will never heal. Dream of hope, that fragile, stubborn thing that refuses to die even when everything else has. The reinforcements are coming. The Lion and the Lord of Ultramar are finally coming. The siege continues, the walls still stand, and somewhere in the darkness, warriors prepare for the battles yet to come. Until next time.